The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dante Morelli's penthouse in Milan, casting long shadows across marble floors that had witnessed decades of power consolidation. Outside, the city awakened to another ordinary Friday. Traffic congesting the Navigli district, espresso machines hissing in corner bars, tourists beginning their pilgrimage through Renaissance streets. Inside, everything was about to change. Dante stood shirtless before his floor mirror, the physique of a man who disciplined his body as ruthlessly as he controlled his empire. At 53, his dark hair showed distinguished silver at the temples. His face bore the weathered complexity of someone who had spent 3 decades navigating the treacherous waters of organized crime, not born into violence, but choosing it, refining it, perfecting it. His hands were large and deliberate, each movement calculated. He was reviewing the morning's security briefings on his personal tablet when the phone call came, not from a subordinate, but from his lawyer, Marco Benedetti, whose voice carried a tremor that Dante had never heard in 15 years of professional relationship. "Don't turn on the news," Marco said, the words tumbling out with urgency. "Don't go anywhere. I'm coming to you." Adine. But Dante had already reached for the remote. The television illuminated with the kind of brightness that precedes catastrophe. Within seconds, his face appeared on every major news channel, not as a businessman or philanthropist, but as Europe's most wanted criminal. The headlines scrolled relentlessly. Leaked. Dante Morelli's empire of crime, decades of offshore accounts, human trafficking, drug cartels, exposed. The images came in succession, each more damaging than the last. Financial documents with his signature, exact replicas of his handwriting. Wire transfer confirmations from accounts he'd never seen. Surveillance footage of him at meetings he never attended, conducting transactions he never made. There were audio recordings, his voice unmistakable, discussing murders, bribes, corruption. But Dante knew, with the clarity of a man whose memory was his most dangerous weapon, he had never said those words. He had never been in those places. His hands trembled slightly as he watched, not from fear, but from the recognition of a sophisticated trap. This wasn't the work of a rival family or a vengeful competitor. This was something else entirely, something he couldn't fight with traditional methods. The documents were too perfect, too comprehensive. There were no loose ends, no contradictions that would allow him to dismantle the case through legal channels or strategic elimination. The phone exploded with activity. His men, his associates, his longtime allies, all calling with either suspicion or panic or both. His bank accounts frozen within hours. Interpol issued a red notice. The Italian government, emboldened by the evidence, moved with unusual speed and coordination. Within 12 hours, the empire that had taken Dante 3 decades to build was hemorrhaging from 1,000 cuts. But it was the isolation that cut deepest. He called his consigliere, the man who had orchestrated deals across 3 continents. No answer. He reached out to the heads of allied families who owed him allegiances sealed in blood. Their phones went to voicemail. By evening, even his inner circle of bodyguards seemed to regard him with something closer to skepticism than loyalty. Doubt had metastasized through the organization faster than any biological virus could spread through a body. Dante moved through his penthouse like a phantom, watching his empire collapse in real time on screens that had once displayed his victories. The realization crystallized slowly, then completely. Someone had orchestrated a frame so intricate, so perfectly detailed, that the truth had become irrelevant. In the court of public opinion, in the eyes of law enforcement, in the mind of every associate who had ever benefited from his protection, he was guilty. The question that haunted him as night fell wasn't whether he would survive. It was whether the man who emerged from this ordeal would be recognizable as human at all. 2 weeks earlier, before the world knew Dante Morelli's name, Sofia Caruso sat in a glass-walled office on the 37th floor of a Milan corporate tower, staring at her computer screen with the focused intensity of someone who had learned that detail was the difference between security and catastrophe. At 31, she had already built a reputation in cybersecurity that preceded her into rooms before she entered them. Her work had prevented billions in theft, exposed corporate espionage, dismantled ransomware networks. She was, by any measure, brilliant. But brilliance had taught her humility. The digital world evolved constantly, and every assumption could become a vulnerability. Her office was deliberately sparse, no personal photographs, no decorations that might distract. Just the equipment, the screens, the code. Her team respected her, but they also feared her. She demanded precision because precision kept people safe. The call came from a firm she'd never worked with before, a boutique legal practice that specialized in high-profile cases. They needed her for a consulting gig, they explained, sensitive material, extremely confidential. The compensation was substantial enough to make the offer noteworthy, but Sophia had learned that money was often a secondary consideration when the work itself was compelling. 3 days later, she was sitting in a conference room surrounded by lawyers who wore their anxiety like poorly fitted suits. They presented her with a secured laptop and a single directive: authenticate the evidence against a criminal suspect. Verify the documents, the financial records, the audio files, the surveillance footage. Tell us if it's real. Sophia spent the first week in a state of methodical absorption. The evidence was comprehensive, a full architectural blueprint of criminal enterprise. She examined metadata, traced digital signatures, tested audio for compression artifacts and synthetic modifications. She ran every forensic test she knew and several she invented on the spot, and everything checked out. This was the part that bothered her most, the flawlessness of it all. In her 15 years of digital forensics, she had never encountered anything so immaculately constructed. Real criminals left traces. Real documents had variations in compression, metadata that didn't align perfectly, small inconsistencies that human fabricators couldn't quite eliminate. Real evidence was messy because the real world was messy. This evidence was too clean, too perfect. She began running deeper analyses, looking not at what the evidence showed, but at how it was constructed. She wrote algorithms to detect statistical impossibilities. She examined the timing of file creation and modification. She traced the encryption protocols used to secure the data. 2 weeks into the investigation, at 3:47 a.m. in her apartment, sitting alone with 3 cups of cold coffee and the ambient hum of her equipment, Sophia found it. A single anomaly, so minor that any conventional analysis would have missed it entirely. A microsecond deviation in an encryption signature. A pattern that repeated across multiple files but existed in no legitimate encryption methodology she could identify. Someone had layered an additional security protocol over the evidence. Someone had hidden a signature that identified them as the creator, concealed so expertly that it took her days of concentrated effort to surface it. Sophia's mind did what it always did when faced with a puzzle. It began to reconstruct. If this signature was artificial, if these files were fabricated, if the evidence was synthetically constructed with such sophistication, then the question became, what technology was required to accomplish this? The answer that emerged was both terrifying and obvious. Artificial intelligence. Someone had used advanced AI systems to generate the documents, create the deepfakes, construct the false evidence. Not a person or even a small group, but an algorithm, a trained neural network capable of generating content so sophisticated that it had fooled not only conventional forensics, but also her own initial analysis, which meant the person behind it wasn't just smart. They were revolutionary. Sophia sat back in her chair, the apartment silent except for the subtle electrical hum of her equipment, and realized she was staring into an abyss that had already begun staring back at her. Because if someone was capable of creating evidence so convincing, so architecturally sound, then they were also capable of doing it again. And if they were doing it to frame a criminal, what would stop them from doing it to frame anyone else? What was to prevent them from turning their algorithmic eye toward her? She began to check her own systems with trembling hands, looking for signs of external access, for evidence that she too was being watched. The office of Marco Benedetti, Dante's attorney, occupied the ground floor of a historic building in the Brera district. It was a place designed to project permanence and discretion, wood paneling, leather chairs, the aroma of old paper and older money. It was also the location where Sophia arrived 3 weeks into her investigation, carrying a laptop and the kind of certainty that comes from having reconstructed an impossible truth. She had requested the meeting through confidential channels, understanding that if she was right, if the evidence was fabricated, if an artificial intelligence had been weaponized to construct a frame, then she was potentially putting herself in danger by even existing on someone's radar. She had also understood that the only person with sufficient motivation to investigate the truth was the man being destroyed by the lies. Dante received her in a private room, and the contrast between his reputation and his reality was immediate. The man before her wasn't the monster described in the leaked documents. He was something more complex, someone whose eyes carried the weight of 3 decades of decisions, some of them undoubtedly immoral, but all of them consciously made. He studied her with the intensity of someone who had spent his life reading people, and Sophia felt genuinely transparent under that gaze. She presented her findings without embellishment: the encryption signature, the statistical impossibilities, the AI methodology. She walked him through the analysis, showing him not just what was false, but how she knew it was false. She explained that the sophistication required to accomplish this wasn't available in public markets. Whoever had done this had either developed proprietary technology or had access to military-grade artificial intelligence systems. Dante listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from skepticism to something closer to recognition. When she finished, he asked a single question: who? Sophia explained that she didn't know yet, but she had discovered something else. The same AI signature had begun appearing in her own systems. Someone was trying to access her files, her communications, her research. Someone was, in fact, watching her the way she was watching them. "They know you know," Dante said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," Sophia confirmed, "and that means they'll either try to discredit me or they'll try to silence me." Dante made a decision then, the kind of decision that men in his position make when they recognize that their traditional weapons are useless. He decided to trust her. He decided to work with her. He decided that together they would trace the signature back to its source. What followed was a strange convergence of underworld contacts and digital forensics. Dante still had reach, even with his accounts frozen and his reputation destroyed. He had men positioned throughout Milan, people who understood the physical world, who could surveil, who could move through spaces without attracting attention. Sophia had the technical expertise to identify patterns that others couldn't see. They began building a map of the conspiracy, pulling threads that led in unexpected directions. The AI signature appeared in communications within Dante's own organization. Loyalty, which Dante had cultivated through decades of careful relationship management, began to reveal itself as more transactional than he had believed. There were 3 senior members of his organization who had begun meeting in private, encrypted channels. There were financial transfers from external sources, sources that appeared to be legitimate technology firms, but which, when traced, led to shell companies with AI development expertise. There was a pattern emerging, and the pattern suggested that someone within the organization had decided that the era of traditional mob control was ending, and that the future belonged to whoever could harness algorithmic power. The investigation consumed them both. Weeks of encrypted communications, dead drops of physical evidence, technical analysis conducted in safe houses because they couldn't trust anyone in the legitimate channels. Sophia's apartment became unsafe, so she moved through a series of safe locations that Dante maintained. The two of them developed a rhythm, a way of working together that transcended the natural suspicion between a crime boss and a cybersecurity analyst. And somewhere in that process, something else emerged. A recognition of shared vulnerability, a connection forged through adversity. They were both targets now, both pieces in a game being played by someone with resources and sophistication neither of them could fully comprehend. By the third week, they had narrowed the field to one man, Giovanni Rossi, Dante's consigliere for the past 8 years. The man who had access to everything, to financial systems, to communication protocols, to the inner structure of the organization. The man who had orchestrated Dante's rise, and who had apparently decided that the most efficient path to power wasn't to inherit the throne, but to destroy the king and rebuild the system in his own image. The data center sat on the outskirts of Milan, disguised as a legitimate server facility for a technology consulting firm. It was surrounded by industrial buildings and access roads that attracted no particular attention. It was the perfect place to hide something significant, in plain sight, protected by the assumption that nothing valuable would be stored in such an ordinary location. Sophia and Dante arrived separately, approaching from different vectors. The security was minimal, cameras without active monitoring, doors that Dante's men had learned to open through means that didn't involve keys. What they found inside was both simpler and more sophisticated than they had anticipated. A room filled with high-end server equipment, cooled to precise temperatures, running algorithms that existed in the space between theoretical computer science and practical criminal application. Giovanni Rossi was already there, standing before the servers like a man gazing at his greatest creation. He didn't seem surprised to see them. Perhaps he had been monitoring their investigation all along, allowing them to follow the breadcrumbs he had deliberately left. He explained his methodology with the pride of an artist discussing his masterpiece. He had spent 7 years developing AI systems capable of generating falsified evidence so sophisticated that it couldn't be detected by conventional forensics. He had stolen proprietary technology from 3 different defense contractors. He had learned to weaponize artificial intelligence in ways that academic researchers had theorized but never attempted. And he had chosen Dante as his first large-scale experiment, not out of malice, but out of a cold calculation. Dante represented the old world, the analog world of violence and personal relationships. The future, Giovanni believed, belonged to those who could manipulate data, perception, and narrative. The future belonged to those who understood that in the digital age, truth was less important than convincing everyone that you controlled the truth. Giovanni's plan was already in motion. Using the same AI methodology that had destroyed Dante, he was constructing evidence against 3 other major crime figures across Europe. He had already distributed copies of the AI to criminal organizations in Russia, China, and South America. The technology was spreading, metastasizing through the digital underworld like a virus that had no cure. What Giovanni hadn't anticipated was that Sophia had already traced his AI signature deeper than he realized. She had identified not just the methodology, but the actual neural network architecture. She had, in the weeks preceding this moment, been developing a counter-algorithm, a piece of code designed to corrupt the AI from within, to turn its own learning mechanisms against itself. The confrontation that followed wasn't the gunfight that the traditional criminal narrative might have suggested. It was something far more modern, far more strange. Sophia moved toward the server array, implementing her counter-algorithm. Giovanni moved to stop her, not with violence, but with the kind of desperation that comes from watching your life's work being destroyed in real time. Dante moved with the decisiveness of a man who understood that in this moment the world was changing. He ensured that Sophia's code reached the servers, that the cascade of corruption began. He watched as Giovanni realized with the clarity of the truly intelligent that the future he had been constructing was collapsing before it had fully formed. The data center's automated systems began to fail. The servers overheated as the corrupted algorithm consumed resources attempting to repair itself, creating a feedback loop that led only to destruction. Weeks of development, years of stolen technology, the potential to reshape criminal enterprise across an entire continent, all of it dissipating in heat and electrical discharge. In the aftermath, as emergency services responded to the fire that consumed the facility, Dante made a choice that surprised even those closest to him. Instead of disappearing with the evidence that had framed him, evidence that could now be definitively proven false, he allowed it to surface through legitimate channels. He allowed the forensic analysis to proceed, allowed investigators to discover exactly what had been done to him. The public narrative shifted. Dante emerged not as the criminal the world had believed, but as the victim of a conspiracy of almost incomprehensible sophistication. His reputation remained tarnished. Decades of actual criminal enterprise don't disappear because of one successful frame job. But he survived. More than that, he understood something that few men in his position ever truly grasp. That power in the modern world isn't about who controls the most violence, but about who controls the narrative. And he had learned that lesson from a woman whose skill with code exceeded his skill with strategy. Sophia disappeared into a new identity, protected by sources she would never fully reveal. She had proven something that intelligence agencies were only beginning to understand, that artificial intelligence, in the wrong hands, could be far more dangerous than any traditional weapon. She had also proven that it could be defeated, not by other technology, but by human intelligence, human intuition, and human persistence. The investigation into Giovanni Rossi moved through official channels, though he was never prosecuted. The evidence against him was too contaminated, too intertwined with the very technology he had used. He spent the remainder of his life in a secure psychiatric facility, understanding but unable to communicate how close he had come to reshaping the entire criminal infrastructure of Europe. In the months that followed, Dante made changes. He began transitioning his organization away from traditional criminal enterprise toward legitimate business operations. Whether this was genuine reformation or merely a tactical repositioning remained unclear. What was clear was that he had been fundamentally altered by the experience, that the certainty which had carried him through 3 decades had been replaced by something more complex. The understanding that the world was changing faster than even men of his intelligence could fully comprehend. And somewhere in the digital spaces between Milan and destinations unknown, Sophia continued her work, finding threats before they fully manifested, hunting algorithms that had been designed to destroy people, understanding that the real danger in the modern world came not from men with guns, but from men with code. The story of Dante Morelli and Sofia Caruso became legend in certain circles, whispered in underworld bars as a cautionary tale about the future, discussed in intelligence briefings as a case study of emerging threats. It was the story of the moment when organized crime collided with artificial intelligence, and neither emerged unchanged. It was the moment when the underworld learned that power in the 21st century flows through fiber optic cables and machine learning algorithms, and that the wars of the future would be fought not with bullets, but with data. This was their story. The story of 2 people who discovered that in a world of digital deception, truth becomes an act of rebellion. If you want to see what happens next, if you want to follow more stories about people pushed to their limits, about mysteries that unfold in the spaces between code and conscience, about the collision between the old world and the new world, Then subscribe to this channel now. We create narratives that matter, stories that linger, mysteries that pull you deeper. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of human drama, technological thriller, and the kinds of stories that remind us why we're here. Your subscription helps us bring more of these stories to life. Thank you for watching. The investigation that followed the destruction of Giovanni Rossi's data center became one of the most complex forensic operations in Italian legal history. Federal agents, Interpol specialists, and cybersecurity experts from 3 different countries descended upon Milan with the kind of coordinated intensity usually reserved for terrorism cases. Because, in a very real sense, what Giovanni had attempted was a form of terrorism, not directed at a specific nation or ideology, but at the fundamental concept of truth itself. The official findings took months to compile, but the conclusion was unambiguous. Giovanni Rossi had weaponized artificial intelligence on a scale that had never been attempted before. The neural networks he had developed were so sophisticated that they represented a genuine breakthrough in machine learning architecture. In another context, in another world, his work might have earned him accolades from the academic community, research positions at prestigious universities, a place in the history of technological innovation. Instead, it earned him a cell in a secure psychiatric facility in the mountains outside Bolzano, where he spent his days speaking to therapists about his vision of a world where artificial intelligence liberated criminal organizations from the constraints of human logic. The Italian government, once his findings were declassified, immediately implemented new cybersecurity protocols. An entire division of the National Cybersecurity Agency was restructured around what had become known as the Rossi precedent, the understood reality that artificial intelligence could now be used to create evidence so convincing that distinguishing it from reality required forensic analysis at the bleeding edge of what was technologically possible. Training programs were established. New legislation was drafted. International cooperation frameworks were formalized, but the real story of those 6 months, the story that would never appear in official reports, was about what happened to the people at the center of the crisis. Dante Morelli, the man who had spent 30 years consolidating power through violence and strategic manipulation, discovered that rehabilitation, real rehabilitation, was far more difficult than he had anticipated. The process of transitioning his organization away from traditional criminal enterprise was complicated by the simple fact that most of his subordinates didn't want to transition. They had built lives around violence, around the kind of power that came from fear. Legitimate business operations offered money, certainly, but they didn't offer the intoxicating combination of danger and significance that had drawn men to organized crime in the first place. 3 of his lieutenants, perhaps sensing that the old order was genuinely ending, attempted to orchestrate a coup. They moved quickly, with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested they had been planning it for months. But they had underestimated Dante's transformation. The man they faced wasn't the same person who had run the organization through traditional means. He was someone who had learned, through his ordeal with Giovanni Rossi, that the most effective power came not from eliminating rivals, but from understanding them. He didn't kill the men who moved against him. Instead, he negotiated. He offered them positions in the legitimate businesses he was establishing. He gave them equity stakes in pharmaceutical distribution networks, real estate development companies, technology startups. He transformed potential enemies into business partners, and in doing so, he proved something that few crime bosses ever truly understand: that the skills that build criminal empires, strategic thinking, the ability to navigate complex networks, the capacity to inspire loyalty and manage competing interests, are precisely the skills required to build legitimate empires. Within 6 months, Dante's organization had transformed from a traditional mafia structure into something that resembled a multinational holding company. The transition wasn't complete, and likely never would be. Old networks, old loyalties, old methods don't disappear simply because new leadership decides they should. But the momentum had shifted. The violence that had characterized his reign was being replaced gradually and imperfectly by something closer to legitimate corporate strategy. Dante's personal transformation was more complicated. He had killed people. He had ordered the deaths of rivals and enemies, and occasionally people who simply knew too much. No amount of legitimate business success could erase that history. He began meeting with priests, not in the confessional, because he wasn't looking for absolution through religious channels, but in quiet conversations in the back of churches, discussing theology and morality and the question of whether redemption was possible for someone who had spent decades building an empire on suffering. The priests he spoke with offered no definitive answers, which was perhaps the only honest response available. One of them suggested that redemption wasn't a destination, but a direction. That the point wasn't to become someone without a past, but to become someone whose present and future moved towards something better than the past had been. Dante found this framing oddly comforting, perhaps because it didn't demand impossible transformation, only genuine effort towards something more humane than what had come before. He never fully escaped his past. Federal investigators continued to build cases against him for crimes predating the AI frame-up. The Italian government pursued him through legal channels. He would, in all likelihood, face prosecution and imprisonment before his life ended. But he also knew something that few powerful men ever fully grasp, that the end of power, when it comes, is often less about external collapse and more about internal choice. He had chosen, in the aftermath of his near destruction, to begin the process of dismantling what he had built. That choice, more than any legal judgment, would define the final chapter of his life. He thought often of Sofia during those 6 months, though they had no contact. Their collaboration had been born of necessity and had ended when that necessity was resolved. He understood that she represented something he had lost decades ago, the possibility of being known by someone without the mediation of power. She had seen him at his most vulnerable, and she had chosen to help him anyway, not out of loyalty or fear, but out of principle. The memory of that was both painful and strangely redemptive. Sofia Caruso's life, meanwhile, had transformed in ways that were both more and less dramatic than Dante's. She had been offered positions by every major intelligence agency in Europe, each one promising unlimited resources, prestigious titles, the kind of authority that comes from operating at the highest levels of national security. She had declined all of them. Instead, she had used her newfound prominence and the fortune she had earned from consulting on the Rossi case to establish an independent cybersecurity firm focused on the kind of work that interested her. Identifying threats before they fully manifested, developing defensive technologies against emerging forms of digital attack, and perhaps most importantly, conducting research into the ethical implications of artificial intelligence weaponization. Her firm operated from a converted warehouse in the Milan design district, a space deliberately chosen to emphasize that cybersecurity was becoming as much an art as a science. She employed 43 people, most of them younger than her, most of them possessing the kind of brilliant technical minds that found the traditional career paths in government or corporate environments stifling. Together, they tracked emerging threats in the dark web, analyzed patterns in digital attacks, identified vulnerabilities in AI systems before criminals and hostile nation-states could exploit them. They published research papers that influenced policy discussions at the European Union and NATO. They consulted for major corporations and governments, but always maintaining their independence, never allowing themselves to become incorporated into the structures of power that they were meant to monitor. The work was consuming, and it was also deeply satisfying in ways that Sophia had never experienced in her previous career. She was building something that mattered, something that would, she hoped, contribute to the development of digital infrastructure that was more resilient, more secure, and more human-centered than what currently existed. She had also begun teaching, 2 hours per week at the Politecnico di Milano, where she lectured on advanced cybersecurity topics to graduate students who had grown up with the internet and who possessed intuitions about digital systems that even she found remarkable. One of her students, a young woman named Eleanor with exceptional gifts in machine learning, reminded Sophia of herself at that age. Hungry, curious, convinced that intelligence and determination could solve any problem. Sophia had taken Eleanor under her wing, mentoring her the way she wished someone had mentored her when she was beginning her career. She was determined that the next generation of cybersecurity professionals would understand from the beginning what it had taken her 31 years to learn, that technological power without ethical constraint was simply a different form of the violence that had characterized human history since its beginning. The question that haunted Sophia during those 6 months was the same question that had emerged in the immediate aftermath of the Rossi situation. What happened to the AI? Giovanni's corrupted algorithms had been destroyed, certainly, but the knowledge of what was possible remained. The neural network architectures he had developed, the techniques he had employed to generate undetectable deepfakes, the methodologies for creating false evidence so sophisticated that it fooled even advanced forensic analysis, all of that existed now in the collective knowledge of the cybersecurity community. You couldn't unknow something. You couldn't put technological capability back in the box once it had been released. Sophia spent weeks investigating whether Giovanni's research had been distributed before his arrest. She traced digital footprints across the dark web, analyzed server logs, interviewed every programmer and engineer who had ever worked with him. What she discovered was both reassuring and terrifying. Giovanni had indeed distributed his work to criminal organizations and hostile nation-states, but the distribution had been incomplete. The truly revolutionary algorithms, the ones that represented genuine breakthroughs in AI methodology, had been contained to his facility and had been destroyed in the fire. What had been distributed was derivative work based on his innovations, but not fully refined. It was dangerous, certainly, and it would require active monitoring, but it wasn't the extinction-level threat that fully realized Rossi-grade AI represented. In her quiet moments, usually late at night when she was alone in her office, Sophia sometimes wondered what Giovanni had intended to accomplish with his work. It would have been easy to reduce him to a simple caricature, the brilliant but disturbed technologist who wanted to reshape the criminal underworld through algorithmic manipulation. But Sophia had reviewed his psychological evaluations, had read the papers he had published before his descent into criminal activity, had seen photographs of him as a younger man, before whatever break in his thinking had occurred. She believed that Giovanni had genuinely convinced himself that he was creating something revolutionary, something that would liberate criminal organizations from the constraints of traditional violence and transform them into something more rational, more efficient, more aligned with the emerging realities of the digital age. He had been wrong, of course. The reality was that artificial intelligence in the hands of criminals simply created new forms of the same violence that had always characterized organized crime: deception, coercion, the destruction of human lives for the accumulation of power. But his wrongness didn't make him evil in any simple sense. It made him tragic, a brilliant mind that had become disconnected from the human consequences of his work, someone who had disappeared so far into the realm of pure abstraction that he had lost sight of the fact that algorithms operate on human lives, that data is generated by suffering, that the elegant mathematical solutions he had created were built on the destruction of real people. 6 months after the data center burned, Sofia received a letter. It came through an intermediary, through channels designed to ensure that it couldn't be traced. It was from Giovanni Rossi, written from his secure facility, his handwriting shaky in places, but otherwise legible. He wrote about his regret. Though the regret he expressed was complicated, he regretted that his work had been destroyed, regretted that his vision hadn't fully materialized, but also regretted, in a way that seemed genuine, the harm that had been caused to Dante and others in the process. He wrote about his understanding of what Sofia had done, how she had essentially created a counter-algorithm designed to destroy his life's work from within. He wrote about viewing that destruction as both a devastating personal loss and a kind of strange validation that her work was sophisticated enough to understand and defeat his work, meant that his work had been genuinely revolutionary. It was an odd letter, simultaneously full of genuine remorse and stubborn conviction that his underlying vision had been correct. Only the execution had been flawed. Sofia read it dozens of times, trying to extract meaning from sentences that seemed to contradict each other. She ultimately filed it away, neither responding nor destroying it, uncertain what would constitute an appropriate response to a man who had become a symbol of threats that she would spend the rest of her life working to prevent. The months following the Rossi crisis also brought what might be described as unexpected professional recognition. Sofia was profiled in major technology publications, invited to speak at international conferences, offered positions of influence and authority. She accepted some of these opportunities, declined others, always with an eye toward what would actually contribute to her goal of developing more secure and ethical digital infrastructure. She was also, surprisingly, approached by Dante Morelli. The approach came through a secure channel, through intermediaries who took pains to ensure that she understood they were operating outside of traditional law enforcement and legal structures. Dante wanted to hire her, not to work for his criminal organization, but to help him understand and monitor the digital threats that existed within his transitioning empire. As his organization became more legitimate, Dante had realized that he needed expertise in areas that had never been relevant before. He needed to understand cybersecurity vulnerabilities in his legitimate businesses. He needed to monitor the digital traces that every business, no matter how carefully managed, inevitably leaves. He needed to understand the technological landscape that was rapidly becoming as important to business success as physical assets had been in the previous century. Sofia had declined the offer, but she had done so politely, with an explanation that surprised even herself. She told Dante that she couldn't work for him because to do so would essentially be accepting a position within a structure of power, even if that structure was transitioning toward legitimacy. Her role needed to remain independent, needed to remain focused on identifying threats and strengthening defenses without regard to whose interests those defenses served. But she also told him that she respected what he was attempting to do, that the transformation of criminal enterprise into legitimate business was difficult, imperfect, and ongoing, but that it represented something genuinely important. She told him that if he wanted advice, she would give it freely off the books, simply because the stakes of getting the digital infrastructure right were too high for her to refuse on principle. It was an unusual arrangement, but it worked. Over the following months, Sofia occasionally provided consultations to people representing Dante's interests, never formally part of his organization, but contributing technical expertise to questions that emerged. It was a way of being helpful without compromising her independence, of contributing to the redemptive project he had begun without becoming incorporated into the structure he was building. By the end of the 6-month period, the immediate crisis had largely faded from public consciousness. The news cycle had moved on to other scandals, other crimes, other threats. The Rossi case remained in classified government archives, in the computers of cybersecurity professionals, in the institutional memory of organizations that worked in the shadows. It had become historical rather than current, a cautionary tale rather than an active emergency. But for Sophia, for Dante, for the intelligence agencies and law enforcement organizations that had been affected by the crisis, the implications of what had occurred remained acutely present. They had all learned something about the nature of power in the 21st century, that artificial intelligence represented a fundamentally different kind of threat than anything that had come before, that it could attack not just systems or infrastructure, but the very concept of truth itself. They had learned that combating these threats required new skills, new ways of thinking, new institutions designed around principles that hadn't been relevant in the previous century. They had learned that the future was going to be strange, dangerous, and require constant vigilance from people willing to dedicate themselves to understanding and defending against emerging threats. And they had learned something more personal, that human connection, human intuition, and human solidarity were still perhaps the most powerful tools available. A crime boss and a cybersecurity analyst, pushed together by circumstances beyond their control, had managed to defeat a threat that neither of them could have defeated alone. That told them something important about the future, that it wouldn't be won or lost through technological prowess alone, but through the ability to build meaningful connections with other human beings, to trust despite every reason for suspicion, to work together towards something more important than personal survival. In her office, late at night, Sophia sometimes looked at her screens and thought about what Giovanni Rossi had tried to create. She thought about the algorithms running in data centers around the world, learning, adapting, becoming increasingly sophisticated with each passing day. She thought about the race that had begun, a race between the development of increasingly powerful artificial intelligence and the development of defenses capable of controlling that power. She knew, with the clarity of someone who had looked into the abyss of what artificial intelligence could become, that this race would define the next century of human history. She knew that the outcome was far from certain. She knew that people like her would be working constantly to ensure that technological power served human values rather than replacing them. But she also knew that she had already proven something important, that the threats could be recognized, analyzed, defeated. That human intelligence, combined with appropriate technical expertise, could still overcome threats that seemed insurmountable, that the future, while uncertain, wasn't predetermined. And on those nights, alone in her office, surrounded by the hum of equipment and the glow of screens, Sophia felt something that resembled hope. Not naive hope that everything would work out, but realistic hope that the struggle was worth engaging, that the work of building secure and ethical digital infrastructure was some of the most important work available to her generation. Dante, meanwhile, sat in his legitimate office, in his legitimate business, reviewing financial statements and supply chain logistics and human resources decisions, and felt something that might be described as peace. Not the absence of conflict. Conflict would likely define the remainder of his life, but the sense that he was moving in a direction that felt more aligned with his deeper values than the path he had been traveling for 30 years. He had killed people, he had destroyed lives, he had built an empire on suffering. No amount of legitimate business success, no amount of philosophical discussion with priests, no amount of charitable giving would erase that history. But he had also chosen, in the moment when his empire was collapsing, to reach for something different. He had chosen to trust a woman he had no reason to trust. He had chosen to fight for truth rather than for power. He had chosen, incrementally, to transform himself into someone slightly different from who he had been. That wouldn't be enough to make him a good man. The good men were born into better circumstances, made better choices earlier in their lives. But it might be enough to make him a better man. Not good, but better. and perhaps that was all anyone could hope for when they reached the point where their past could no longer be denied or escaped. The story of Dante Morelli and Sofia Caruso didn't end with the destruction of the data center or the immediate aftermath of the crisis. It continued in modified form, in the choices they made in the months that followed, in the slow process of transformation and adaptation that characterized their lives after the moment when artificial intelligence and human violence had collided in a neon-lit facility outside Milan. It continued in the decisions Sofia made about how to use her platform and expertise, in her commitment to ensuring that emerging technologies served human values rather than replacing them. It continued in the incremental, imperfect transformation of Dante's criminal enterprise into something closer to legitimacy, in his recognition that power built on genuine value was more sustainable than power built on fear. And it continued in the broader implications of what had occurred, in the new divisions created within law enforcement agencies, in the research programs established at universities, in the policy discussions that began at the highest levels of government, all focused on the question of how to secure digital infrastructure against threats that previous generations could never have imagined. The future that had begun to emerge in that data center remained uncertain. The artificial intelligence that Giovanni Rossi had developed represented a genuine breakthrough in technological capability, and even though his original algorithms had been destroyed, the knowledge of what was possible remained. The race between the development of increasingly powerful AI and the development of defenses against that power would likely define the next century. But for those who had lived through the crisis, who had watched truth itself become weaponized, and then had managed to restore some semblance of reality through intelligence and determination, there was something that resembled cautious optimism. They had proven that the threats could be confronted. They had proven that human ingenuity could still overcome technological challenges that seemed insurmountable. They had proven that the future, while uncertain, wasn't predetermined by forces beyond human control. And in that proof, in that demonstration of human capacity to adapt, to persist, to overcome, perhaps there was the foundation for hope that humanity could navigate the dangerous waters of increasingly powerful technology without losing itself in the process.